will be able to come back and join us for that program. Thanks to Caleb Labby, who you just saw come up and fix the microphone. We are live streaming this presentation on the new Pierce Mance YouTube channel. So it will be available for you to watch at any time after that. There'll be a video of the program that you can pick up on that channel afterwards. Please join us for refreshments after the program. Thanks to Nancy Franson, Cindy Merrill, and Joan Woodhead. That's me. We are pleased to have Matt Fisk back to present this program on Lincoln and his cast of characters. Matt is an educator and assistant principal at Bow High School. He has a bachelor's degree in history and a master's in secondary education from UNH. Matt has presented programs at New Hampshire Social Studies conferences, the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and at the International Baccalaureate program at a gathering of educational consultants. So you can see he's well qualified to talk about Lincoln and his cast of characters. So please join me in welcoming Matt Fisk.
Thank you, everybody. Usually as assistant principal, when people come to see me, I don't get applause, so I appreciate it. So I wanted to take a little bit of time this afternoon and talk about some of the men who played a role in the outcome of the Civil War. There were lots and lots of individuals who we could talk about. We could talk about Colonel Cross from New Hampshire's own Fighting 5th Regiment. We could talk about any number of the Confederate generals. But some of the people I chose to talk about today are people who have an interesting background, people who had military credentials, but also many skeletons in their closet. Before jumping in to talk about some of those men, I thought it'd be nice to talk just a quick lead up to what was taking place in the United States in the years that led up to the American Civil War in 1861. So this painting depicts the Constitutional Convention, Philadelphia, 1787. The relevance to the Civil War is at this convention, the decision was made that when the census would be taken to determine representation in Congress, that enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person. The 3/5 was decided upon very intentionally because when the Constitution went into effect, that would give equal power to the northern and the southern states. And so when the Constitution came together, it really was about trying to create a compromise that would allow the nation to go forward. And so slavery, at that point, when the Constitution was put into effect, slavery was actually on the decline in the United States. There were fewer and fewer enslaved people being brought over from other continents, and the southern agriculture at the time the Constitution was drafted wasn't really based on slave labor. That changed in 1797 when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And the cotton gin, what that did is it removed seeds from cotton, which allowed the cotton industry to explode in the South. So there began to be a higher demand for cotton, so a higher demand for cotton to be harvested, which meant there needed to be more workers to harvest the cotton. And so very quickly, slavery did start to explode in the South. 1808, the United States bans the slave trade, but by that point, slavery had become pretty entrenched throughout parts of the South. I'll pause here. As a history teacher, when I talk to my students about slavery, very much, especially teaching in New Hampshire or northern state, we're the good guys and the South, they're the bad guys. And it's really easy for our students to say, well, up here in New Hampshire, we got rid of slavery like way back in the late 1700s, so obviously we're the good guys. So one of the things I point out to our students is that is true, that New Hampshire abolished slavery well before southern states did. But there's a key difference. In New Hampshire, when slavery was abolished, the enslaved population was very small. We're talking less than 5% of the New Hampshire population was made up of enslaved people. South Carolina in 1861, the year that the Civil War began, over 60% of the population was non-white. It was, and I'm not defending slavery, do not put this on the paper that I'm defending slavery. It was easier for New Hampshire to do the right thing than it would be for South Carolina. South Carolina abolishing slavery in 1861 would have been a complete political, social, economic upheaval. In New Hampshire, it wasn't that. However, we have, at the time the Civil War is about to break out, we do have this conflict of slavery that is tearing the nation apart. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, in a series of letters back and forth with the second president of the United States, John Adams, Jefferson said, we have the wolf being slavery, by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice on one scale and self-preservation on the other. Jefferson is recognizing the very clear conundrum that the United States finds itself in on the eve of the Civil War, that you can keep slavery and tear the nation apart, or you can abolish slavery and tear the nation apart. The year that Jefferson made that statement, the Missouri Compromise is passed. So this is 1820. And the Missouri Compromise put into place an arrangement that said the states that are south of the 36th line of parallel would be slave states. The states north of that would be free states. And this is where we get the Mason-Dixon line, right? So this is what is the figurative and literal divide between north and south along the 36th line of parallel. Part of the compromise said Missouri, although it was above the 36th, would enter as a slave state, and Maine, which was going to be newly formed out of Massachusetts, would enter as a free state. That was done to maintain the balance of power between southern and northern states. And for a series of years, that compromise held until we have the Mexican-American War in 1846. The Mexican-American War is significant for many reasons, one of which, when we're talking specifically about some of the men who fought during the Civil War, Franklin Pierce served during the Mexican-American War. Over 100 different generals on both sides of the conflict served during the Mexican-American War. One of the other important aspects of that war is after the United States and Mexico ceased hostilities, the United States had acquired all this new land out west, and it really brought to forefront that question again, what do you do with all this new territory? Is it going to enter the country as free, or is it going to enter as slave? And it brings us to the decade directly preceding the American Civil War. The picture you have in the top left-hand corner is a picture of Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, brutally beating Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. In a speech on slavery, Charles Sumner said some things about a political opponent who happened to be that congressman's uncle. And the next day, the congressman sees Senator Sumner in the halls of Congress and beats him with a hickory stick. After that incident, he goes on to become governor of South Carolina and is sent many, many hickory sticks from admirers. Sumner would not recover until midway through the American Civil War. So by the 1863, she's back in the halls of Congress and then plays a role in the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The picture in the top right-hand corner depicts Bleeding Kansas. Kansas and Nebraska had been allowed to decide for themselves whether they were going to be slave or free. Nebraska, it was pretty much, people could read the tea leaves and say Nebraska is going to enter as a free state. So that meant Kansas. What do we do with Kansas? If Kansas enters as a free state, the balance of power swings to the north. If it enters as a slave state, the balance of power swings to the south. And so you had all of these people on both sides of the issue flood into Kansas, and there was a civil war there where both sides engaged in fighting. The man in the bottom left, John Brown, actually massacred, along with his family bonding experience, him and a couple of his boys went out and they hacked to death, with axes, some pro-slavery settlers, just to kind of give a sense of the violence that was there. I'll come back to him in a moment. Part of the compromise of 1850 that led to Bleeding Kansas allowed for slaves who had escaped the South to be returned to the South. So even though New Hampshire was a free state, the Fugitive Slave Act said if a slave made it up here and was captured, that individual could be taken back into bondage down in the South. I mention that because oftentimes in talking about causes of the Civil War, you'll hear about economic causes. You'll hear about states' rights, and Southerners were fighting for independent states' rights. In this clear example, they were fighting for federal government control. It wasn't about New Hampshire had a law that said there is no slavery. The South in this case said, well, the federal government said if a slave comes into your country, into your state, they're still a slave and has to come back. All the issues I think tie into slavery. John Brown, 1859. Leads an attempted uprising at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Today, Harper's Ferry is in West Virginia. West Virginia became a state during the Civil War. But in 1859, Harper's Ferry, along with Springfield, Massachusetts, were two of the biggest depots of military equipment. Brown leads an attempted revolt there, and it fails. And that really was one of those moments that really divided the country, where you had some people saying this man is a terrorist and a traitor, and others saying he's a freedom fighter and a hero. And the divide was really stark. Frederick Douglass called him the meteor because his actions were like a meteor slamming into the earth that was going to cause an upheaval. And the upheaval was caused because on April 12, 1861, the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So to talk about some of Lincoln's cast of characters here, I want to go back quickly to the Mexican-American War because over 200 total, approximately 100 generals on each side served during the Mexican-American War. Generals such as Thomas Stonewall Jackson, General George Meade, who was the commanding general at the Battle of Gettysburg, McClellan, who I'll talk about, George Pickett, who led the famous Pickett Charge on the third day of Gettysburg. A name I'll mention, Braxton Bragg. I mentioned his name because his name has been in the news the last couple of weeks. Fort Bragg in North Carolina is a really large marine base. Many Marines make their way through Fort Bragg. That base has just in the last couple of weeks been renamed Fort Liberty. Some of the other generals who fought there, of course, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. I'm going to quickly talk through the command structure. The command structure on the Union side during the Civil War, you have the Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln. Under Lincoln, you have the Secretary of War. Today, that's the Secretary of Defense. The title changed after World War II, but as a part of the Cold War, we didn't want to be the Secretary of War. We wanted to be Secretary of Defense, which sounds nicer when you're trying to influence other nations. During this period, it's the Secretary of War. Underneath the Secretary of War is the General-in-Chief. I liken that position to today's Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So the President, the Secretary of War, and the General-in-Chief are really the people who had the biggest role in determining strategy for the Union. General-in-Chiefs for the Union go through several different individuals. The first I'll talk about in a minute, Winfield Scott, who at the time the Civil War broke out was 74 years old. George McClellan, who was well less than half his age, took over. And then you have Henry Halleck and ultimately Ulysses S. Grant, who ends the war as the General-in-Chief. I'm just going to quickly talk here. No need to read this. President, Secretary of War, General-in-Chief. So just showing the command structure of the Union. This man here was the Secretary of War for the majority of the Civil War. Edwin Stanton, initially was a lawyer, and he actually met Lincoln when they were both practicing law together. Stanton was quoted, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but Stanton was not impressed with Lincoln. He basically thought Lincoln was a backwoods country lawyer who didn't know what he was doing, really did not respect Lincoln very much. They worked together on a case, and Stanton kind of treated him like an intern who he said, just go get me some coffee. I'll take care of the real heavy lifting here. So didn't have a very good impression of Lincoln. He did play a role in the first ever trial in which the temporary insanity defense was used, which we'll come back to. At the end of James Buchanan's presidency, so this is the president directly before Abraham Lincoln, Stanton happened to be in Washington, and he was on his way home and found out that he had been nominated to be the Attorney General of the United States, and so quickly turned around and served the last 3 months as Attorney General of the United States. When the Civil War breaks out, Stanton is serving as an informal advisor to the first Secretary of War, a man named Simon Cameron, and then Cameron is replaced by Stanton when Lincoln really wanted a really strong individual in that role. One of the things about Stanton and his relationship with Lincoln, they initially began as not adversaries, but there wasn't a lot of respect from Stanton towards Lincoln. By the time of Lincoln's assassination, Stanton had grown to really, really love this man. It was him who gave the quote that now he belongs to the ages. So Stanton had gone from being a critic of Lincoln to being one of his biggest advocates and supporters. Lincoln really liked him because ultimately when somebody's given a death warrant for military crimes, the president has to sign off on it. And Lincoln was a notorious, he had a soft heart. And so Stanton once said that he knew that anytime he had to sign a death warrant, he never felt all that guilty because he always knew Lincoln was behind him who would countermand him. The Army of the Potomac is where we spend a lot of time in Civil War history talking about. This is the Army that fights at Antietam. This is the Army that fights in Northern Virginia, the Army that fights at Gettysburg. This is the Army where some of the most interesting, read worst generals on the Union side are stationed. Irwin McDowell is the general when the first battle of the Civil War is fought that the Union absolutely blows. McClellan takes over for him, he's fired. Burnside takes over, he's fired. Hooker takes over, he's fired. And then finally George Meade is put in command. George Meade, I put a little asterisk next to George Meade's name because he ends up being the commander of the Army of the Potomac all the way to the end of the Civil War, but Ulysses S. Grant, his boss, happened to make his quarters the same headquarters of the Army of the Potomac. So it's kind of like being the general manager and having your boss with you the entire time. So Meade was technically in control, technically in command of the battle of the Army of the Potomac, but Grant was there actually issuing the orders. This is the first leader, the first general-in-chief of the Union forces when the Civil War breaks out. This is Winfield Scott, and he was given the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers. The nickname comes because during the War of 1812 and then during the Mexican-American War, one of the things he did brilliantly was to take a group of volunteer soldiers and whip them into fighting shape. One of the ways he did that was by emphasizing military structure, military order, and appearance. So this would be one of those military leaders who say, all right, put out your hands. Let's make sure your fingernails aren't too long. Let's make sure your uniform's clean. Let's make sure your rifle is nice and polished. And so that actually served to really get the group into fighting shape. But it also gave him this nickname that sometimes people said, oh, you're just worried about all those fuss and feathers. He fought brilliantly during the War of 1812. He was given promotions. He was given recognitions. When the Mexican-American War breaks out, he's in command of United States forces. He's a major general at that point. When the Civil War begins, he's 74 years old, and he's slowed down. Him admittedly has said, I've slowed down. And he had doubts in his own ability to be an effective leader. Just as a side note, the leading candidates for the Democratic and Republican nomination are both significantly older than 74. One of the things that this connects to Franklin Pierce is Winfield Scott was the person who ran against him in the 1852 presidential campaign. Prior to the Republican Party, there was this party called the Whigs. In some ways, a lot of Whigs, a lot of members of the Whig Party would transition to be Republicans. So the Whigs had a history of nominating former military leaders to be their candidate. And in 1852, it's Winfield Scott's turn to be nominated. So he gets the nomination. This political cartoon is based on his vanity and his love of military adornments. He's depicted here as, this says being hatched a bad egg. The bad egg being that the Whigs were seen as the party that was against the expansion of slavery and the abolition of slavery. Winfield Scott was accused of being a pawn being played by William Seward. Seward was a senator from New York who would go on to be Lincoln's Secretary of State. So he was very much seen as just the next guy, not necessarily anything based on his own personal beliefs. This is a cartoon that depicts him with Franklin Pierce. The captions there, Scott turns to Pierce, and what Scott is saying is, "What's the matter, Pierce? Feel faint? Ha, ha, ha. Lord, what a goose. Don't you wish you had my cock? Well, goodbye, Pierce, goodbye." The reference to fainting is based on a rumor that's been disproven that during the Mexican-American War, Pierce fainted during battle. Not true. Pierce had been injured in battle and was in a lot of pain, not because he was afraid or chickened out or anything like that. So the campaign takes place, and it is a rout. This is the biggest electoral victory since the era of good feeling when James Monroe was re-elected president, almost with no opponent. So Pierce gains the presidency. Scott goes back to his role as general-in-chief of the military. So you have the commander-in-chief and his underneath the Secretary of War, and then you have Scott. So Pierce had not necessarily an ally in Scott being his chief military advisor. The ultimate outcome is Scott destroyed the Whig Party. It was such a bad election result that the Whig Party just disintegrated within a number of years. And so by the next election, by the 1856 election, Scott has destroyed the Whig Party and the Republican Party has taken its place. And so the last piece on Scott and his role in the Civil War, his grand strategy he called the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan was this idea that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army would essentially wrap itself around the Confederacy and choke off all trade to eventually choke off their economy to such a point that they would have to re-enter the Union. So the plan was based on control of the major rivers, the Mississippi River, control of the coastline. Ultimately, the plan fails because the people who implemented the plan weren't competent to be able to implement it. And Scott gives up command. He hands over command to his young lieutenant, a man named George McClellan. So George McClellan, he has two nicknames. He's nicknamed Little Mac and Young Napoleon. You can see why he's called Young Napoleon. Like many of the time, he strikes the pose. He was actually, I'm going to really give this guy a lot of hard time in a minute, but to be fair, he was very smart. He graduated number 2 in his class at West Point. The only reason he didn't graduate number 1 is because he had some poor drawing. He was an engineering student, and he had a couple poor drawings, and that's what cost him from being the valedictorian of his graduating class at West Point. He also served in the Mexican-American War. He served directly under Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott and McClellan's dad were really good friends. So Scott really kind of looked after McClellan, treated him almost like a surrogate son. In the years leading up to the Civil War, McClellan made a fortune as an engineer working for rail lines. One of the things that he would do is he would go out and he'd survey what would be the best route for a rail raid to go. And so his services were really in demand. Just as a quick side note, one of the advantages the North has over the South, so we know that the South, states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. North, more unified, more centralized. With the rail lines, that is abundantly true. The distance between the two rails in the northern states were standardized. In the southern states, they weren't standardized. So you could be on a train in Virginia with the rails this far apart, and then you get to North Carolina, and the rails are this far apart. And then you get to South Carolina, and the rails are this far apart. So one of the big advantages the North has is being able to move resources with much more ease than the Confederacy was able to. So in the years leading up to the Civil War, he becomes very wealthy. He marries very wealthy. His wife had certainly Southern sympathies. His wife was Southerner. And McClellan was definitely by no means an abolitionist. By no means was he someone who saw slavery as any sort of issue he wanted to be involved with. Him and Lincoln had probably the worst relationship that any commander-in-chief and general could possibly have. This is actually taken at the end of their relationship. This photograph was taken at the end of September in 1862 when Lincoln is sitting with General McClellan after the Battle of Antietam. There's this couple of stories. One, McClellan referred to Lincoln, I have this quote here, he referred to Lincoln as nothing more than a well-meaning baboon, and he said his Secretary of State, William Seward, was a incompetent little puppy. So this is the general who's leading the Union forces, not showing too much respect. So in November of 1861, Lincoln needs to have a meeting with his general. And so Lincoln goes, along with Stanton, his Secretary of War, and they go to McClellan's house. And they knock on the door, and they're invited in, and they're sitting in the parlor, and the maid says, well, I'm sorry, the general's not here yet. When he gets in, we'll let you know. And so Lincoln is just sitting there in the parlor. Unbeknownst to him, McClellan does return home, is told that Lincoln and the Secretary of War are sitting in his parlor. And McClellan says, okay, that's nice. Goes, puts on his nightgown, has a cup of tea, and goes right to bed. And so Lincoln, after an hour and a half, the maid comes down and says, yeah, sorry about that, but the general's gone to bed. And so Lincoln gets up and leaves. So, and Lincoln, so his aides are like, that guy, he just really was rude to you. And Lincoln, and this is one of the things about his character I think is most amazing, Lincoln said, better at this time not to be making points of etiquette and personal dignity. So Lincoln chose not to take the personal slight, not to let it totally destroy his relationship with McClellan. That said, Lincoln was really frustrated with McClellan. Lincoln wanted and needed action, and McClellan was very, very slow to act. This is one of Lincoln's quotes, if McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it. And he said that directly before the first battles of 1862 that take place in Virginia. McClellan was beloved by his men for good reason. After the first couple battles of the Civil War, where there were a lot of casualties, you have a general who doesn't want to fight. That sounds pretty good, right? Because that's the guy who's not going to be throwing you into combat and having you killed. So men really, really liked McClellan a lot. Lincoln, however, needed a general to act, and so gives him the direct order, you are to march to Virginia and engage the enemy. So McClellan puts together this campaign, the Peninsula Campaign, and he goes into northern Virginia. At the time, he's given troop reports. Allen Pinkerton becomes kind of the first spy master of the United States. In 1861, Pinkerton got notice that there was a plot against Lincoln's life, that when Lincoln was making the trip from Springfield to Washington, there was going to be a stopover in Baltimore, and that there was going to be an assassination attempt on his life. Pinkerton found that out and was able to change Lincoln's schedule to get Lincoln onto a different train and get him into the Capitol without being killed. So the guy's competent. However, he's incompetent when it comes to troop levels. McClellan depended on Pinkerton to give him levels of enemy troops, and Pinkerton almost always exaggerated the number of enemy by 2 times. So if the Army of Northern Virginia had 50,000 men, McClellan was being told they were over 100,000 men. So that, to defend McClellan for a second, that kind of gives the reason for why he was so slow to attack. He always thought he was going to be outmanned. He was never outmanned. In almost every battle, he had the 2-to-1 advantage. During the Battle of the Peninsula, when he's in northern Virginia, there's a series of battles, some last in days. It's during that time when this man from Virginia, Robert E. Lee, takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia. One of the things that we sometimes forget, Robert E. Lee was not a battlefield commander when the Civil War broke out. He was Jefferson Davis's chief military advisor. During the battles in early 1862 in Northern Virginia, the general in charge of Confederate forces, a guy named Johnson, is wounded, and Lee comes out and takes command and then would have command through to the end of the Civil War. So McClellan's slow. Eventually, Lee's able to get the Confederacy on counterattacks. McClellan's forced to retreat out of Northern Virginia, kind of a humiliating defeat for the Army of the Potomac. And then we get to Antietam. So Antietam is located in Sharpsville, Maryland, so right over the border. It's about roughly 45 minutes to an hour from Antietam to Washington, D.C. Lee, in September of 1862, said, "We need to give the South a little bit of relief. All the battles are being fought on our ground. We need to go invade the North." So the Army of Northern Virginia invades the North. McClellan is in pursuit when a couple of his soldiers come up to him with some cigars. And McClellan takes the cigars, and wrapped around the cigars are secret orders, specifically Special Order 191, which Robert E. Lee had written to one of his commanders. McClellan is handed Robert E. Lee's battle plan. And McClellan is quoted as saying, "Here is the paper which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." McClellan then didn't do anything for almost a full 24 hours. So he had McClellan's battle plans and didn't act. Finally, the two armies come together at the Battle of Antietam. So September 17th, 1862 is the bloodiest day in American history. When you take all the casualties from both the Confederacy and the Union and add them together, this is the bloodiest day in all of American history. The battle wasn't a loss, it wasn't a won, it was kind of a draw, considering that the Confederacy was significantly outnumbered. You could make the argument that it was a victory for the South and that they weren't annihilated. You could make the argument it was a victory for the North in that the South did retreat out of Northern territory. And so we're now about a month after the battle, and McClellan hasn't moved. And so Lincoln writes to him and says, essentially, "Man, what are you doing? Could you please go attack the enemy?" And he gets a response back from McClellan that says, "I'd love to, but the horses are too tired." To which Lincoln responds, "I just received your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything?" And so that really was the final straw for Lincoln. He says, I got to have a general who's going to fight. I got to have somebody who's going to take action. And so he fires McClellan. McClellan would go on to become the Democratic candidate for president in 1864 and run against Abraham Lincoln. He loses. Lincoln wins renomination and re-election. McClellan, after the war, would go on to make even more money as a railroad executive. McClellan is replaced by Ambrose Burnside. And like I say, if you're known more for your facial hair than your fighting prowess, that's probably a bad omen for the men that you're leading. So sideburns are literally named after Ambrose Burnside. The first time the term sideburns is used is in 1866 by the telephone Evening Telegraph in Philadelphia, and initially sideburns were called Burnside whiskers. Eventually it changes to sideburns. Again, I'm going to be pretty harsh on him, but he also graduated pretty high in his class at West Point. Before the Civil War, he invented something called the Burnside carbine, which was a rifle that he invented that was really effective. He was well on his way to success until the factory in which his rifle was made burned to the ground and he lost all his money. Before being a failed general, he was a failed lover. This is actually kind of sad, so I feel a little bad saying this. So the story is he gets to the altar and he's going to marry a woman named Charlotte Moon. She's asked, well, will you take this man to be your husband? And according to rumors or stories, she screams, "No, sirree, Bob," and runs out of the church. Later, when the Civil War begins, Burnside is forced to put his ex-fiancée and her family under temporary house arrest because they were spying for the Confederacy. Later, his ex-fiancée was engaged to 16 different Confederate soldiers at the same time because she said she wanted the men to die happy. So he's initially offered command in 1862, July of 1862. This is when McClellan has just been forced out of Northern Virginia, and Lincoln turns to him and says, "I'd like you to take command." And Burnside says, "Oh, you don't want me to take command. I cannot be the guy." So he said, did not have confidence in himself to take command. He also, to his credit, was loyal to McClellan and didn't want to be the person to replace him. At Antietam, one of the reasons this battle is so bloody is because of this bridge. This bridge now is known as Burnside Bridge. It's a little hard to see, but this is the side where my hand is the side that the Union were trying to cross from. And then over here is where the Confederacy was. This is a big hill. What happens during the Battle of Antietam is the Union tried to cross this creek by going over the bridge. The Confederacy had clean shots raining down on them. And as the men piled onto the bridge, they couldn't move forward very fast and just led to the Confederacy being able to shoot over and over and over at them. The really sad thing was that if they had gone just a little bit further in either direction, the water would have come up maybe to a little bit underneath their knee, and they could have crossed without crowding over the bridge, without thousands of men dying. McClellan ended up blaming Burnside for that. So Lincoln decides, I'm firing McClellan. And so Lincoln approaches Burnside and says, I'm firing McClellan no matter what happens. So I'm either going to appoint you as the commander or I'm going to appoint Joe Hooker. And Burnside hated Joe Hooker and said, well, I can't have it be that guy. So yes, I will take command. And so that is Burnside as he assumes command in October of 1862. To his credit, he didn't wait for Lincoln to have to prod him over and over and over and over again to go into action. Burnside leads the Union forces into a battle at Fredericksburg, Virginia, in which the Union forces are absolutely annihilated. The Union couldn't get across the river, and massive casualties. It's a pretty significant defeat for the Union forces. One of the newspaper reporters who was there said, quote, "It can hardly be in human nature for men to show more valor, more courage, or for generals to manifest or show less judgment." It was one of the critiques of Burnside. They were trying to build makeshift bridges to get across, and the entire time they're building these bridges, they're being bombarded with cannon fire, with rifle fire. So it's a pretty big defeat for the Union. About a week later, Burnside has this idea that he's going to quickly march his men right to Richmond, kind of race the Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia, to Richmond. And so he chooses, unfortunately, a day with really bad weather where the ground has thawed and it's really wet, and his men and all of their equipment just gets totally swallowed up by mud. And he loses men, and the army is literally stuck, unable to move. It's humiliating. Lincoln fires him. But then he comes back. So this is now 1864, and Burnside comes back to the Army of the Potomac, not as a commander, but as a division commander. And on June 25th, one of his men comes to him with this idea. The idea is, let's dig underneath the Confederate positions, we'll plant explosives, we'll blow them up, and we'll win. And so Burnside says, that sounds like a good plan, let's do it. Grant says, geez, I don't know. All right, let's give it a try. So Grant does give permission for this to occur. Burnside's men, they dig under, they explode, like the plan said, and yeah, it caught the Confederacy by surprise, and a whole group of Confederate soldiers were taken out by this explosion, and this big crater is formed. Where Burnside messed up, though, is rather than appointing the best person to lead the attack, he instead says to his commanders, come gather around, let's draw straws to see who's going to be the person who's going to actually lead this attack. The person who drew the straw to lead the attack happened to be a raging alcoholic and spent the entire battle passed out in Union lines drinking whiskey while his men were slaughtered. And so this is the last straw for Burnside. Burnside is officially retired for good after that. A couple more quick characters that Lincoln worked with. John C. Fremont. Prior to the Civil War, he was an explorer. He would go out west, and he and his wife would basically do a travel log that became really popular. He was one of the people who popularized moving out west and helped lead to the expansion, or westward expansion of Easterners trying to go out and get land out west. He also happened to marry the daughter of a really, really powerful senator. Thomas Bart Hardin was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs, so a pretty important figure in Washington. Initially, Fremont and his father-in-law didn't get along so well because Fremont took his daughter and they eloped. And so that wasn't a really good way to start off the marriage, but his father-in-law came around to him. He explores the South. The book that he and his wife publish is wildly popular, and people start moving out west. He becomes the first Republican candidate for president in 1856. So when Buchanan gets the Democratic nomination to be president, John C. Fremont is the Republican candidate for president. So Lincoln is the second Republican nominee for president. John Fremont is the first Republican nominee for president in 1856. Skip over that real quick. So as a Civil War general, he had some difficulties. One of the things that he was criticized for was, just like old Fuss and Feathers, he really liked the military appearances. The men that he chose for his headquarters, he went around and he picked 300 of the strongest looking Kentuckians, the sharpest dressed guys to be kind of his personal bodyguards. He also made the unfortunate mistake of picking a fight with the Blair family. One of the Blairs was in Lincoln's cabinet, and Fremont had gone out and gotten into a fight with the cabinet member's brother. And so Fremont was making all of these really, really powerful enemies. I should also say, during his run for the presidency in 1856, his father-in-law didn't endorse him, which probably is not a great sign when family's not endorsing you to be president. The thing that ultimately sinks his career is in August of 1861, he successfully has completed a battle, and he's taken command of a big section of Missouri. Missouri stayed with the Union, but was really fought over. Some of the nastiest fight in the Civil War took place there. One of the things that Fremont does is he issues a proclamation declaring martial law. That alone is it borders on taking away civil liberties. It's a time of war, so Lincoln can excuse that. What Lincoln couldn't excuse is that in the proclamation, Fremont said, any slaves who are in this area that we've just taken over are now freed. So this is before the Emancipation Proclamation. This is right after Lincoln has said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. So Fremont, on his own, has issued an Emancipation Proclamation. And this puts Lincoln in a really, really tough bind. Probably morally, he's there with Fremont. Certainly there are abolitionists and members of the Republican Party who are there with Fremont. But there's a lot of other Republicans and members of the Democrats who stayed with the Union who said, what is going on there? So Lincoln's forced into this position where he tells Fremont, you got to take that order back. Fremont basically doesn't respond, and so Lincoln has to issue a countermand and say, no, we're not confiscating, we're not freeing any slaves. And so the relationship between Fremont and Lincoln break down, not to mention that they're also political rivals, and Fremont has ticked off a member of his cabinet. And so Lincoln makes a decision that he's going to have to remove Fremont from command. Fremont, to his credit, was somebody who was going to follow orders. So Fremont kind of had this idea, if I never get orders that remove me from command, then I'm not removed from command. And so he sets up a kind of a blockade around himself where he will only let people he trusts come near him because he doesn't want anybody to slip him orders that say, you have been removed from command. What Lincoln does is he gives the orders to one of his close allies in Missouri, and that person then chooses two people who dress themselves as farmers, go into where Fremont has his encampment. They try to go see the general. Twice they're turned away. The third time they're able to go see Fremont dressed as farmers and quickly take off their costume and hand him the orders that remove him from command. And Fremont's response is, how did you get through the lines? And so then the guy tells him, oh, here's all the stuff I did. And so Fremont is removed from command. He ends up going to take command in the West where there wasn't very much fighting. And then after the war, continued to publish and explore the Western states. Quickly, the last couple guys. Dan Sickles. He's known for two things. Probably the biggest thing that he is known for is an incident that occurs in 1857. So he had married somebody who was 17 years younger than him. And she, for whatever reason, decided to have an affair. So she is having an affair with another man, and Sickles finds out about it. And Sickles is not very happy to have found out about it. And so he has her write out a confession in which she confesses to adultery. And in the confession, she says, yeah, you know, my guy there will come by the house and he'll, tip his hat, and I'll give him a signal when you're not here so he can come in. And so Sickles is really not happy to hear this. And so a couple days later, he happens to be out walking, and there's the guy. And the guy's walking by his house and tips his hat, and Sickles comes up to him and takes out a gun and shoots him dead right in front of him. The man he shoots happened to be a man named Philip Barden Key II. That was Francis Scott Key's son. So he kills him. And so Sickles, very calmly, after he shoots the guy dead, goes to the Attorney General, turns himself in and says, yeah, I did it. I just shot that guy. And so the case goes to trial. And this is the first time in American history that the temporary insanity defense is tried. So this is one of the cases where Edward Stanton comes into play. And they basically say, yeah, I saw the guy, I flew into a rage, and I shot him. I shouldn't be held accountable because it was just a moment of temporary insanity. The jury spent only an hour deliberating and found him not guilty. So he successfully used the temporary insanity defense. He was a congressman too. He wasn't reelected after that. He does become a Civil War general. One of the things he does is he does raise a militia. The men who served under him really liked him, really respected him. At the Battle of Gettysburg, I think it was day 2 at the Battle of Gettysburg, right in kind of the center of the battlefield, near where Pickett on day 3 would make his charge, a cannonball explodes right next to Sickles, and he loses his leg. If you ever visit the Gettysburg battlefield, there's actually a monument to the exact place where he was standing when he lost his leg. After the war, he would go on to have a pretty distinguished career. He became an advocate for veterans. He won re-election to Congress. He served in Congress for one more term. The last person is probably one of the most colorful generals, General Joe Hooker. And he has probably one of the most scandalous reputations of any of the people who worked directly for Lincoln. One thing just to point out is that so hookers aren't actually named for Joe Hooker. The term actually comes from an area of New York City called the Hookery, and that's where kind of the first red light district was named, and so that's where the name Hookers originates. That said, Joe Hooker himself did nothing to make you think that they weren't named after him. During the Mexican-American War, his nickname was the handsome captain. When the Civil War breaks out, he comes east to see the first Battle of Bull Run, sees the Union lose, and writes a bunch of notes to Lincoln saying, here's what went wrong, here's what I would do. Lincoln ends up appointing him to be a general. During the Peninsula Campaign, the invasion of Northern Virginia under McClellan, Joe Hooker fights very well. At the Battle of Antietam, Joe Hooker fights very well. After Ambrose Burnside messed up every possible thing under his command, Lincoln turns to Hooker and gives Hooker command of the Army of the Potomac. Directly before he's given command, Hooker's quoted as saying about Burnside and about the president, "Nothing will go right until we have a dictator, and the sooner the better." So Lincoln writes to him and says, "I have heard in such a way as to believe it of you recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I've given you command. Only those generals who gain success can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and then I'll worry about the dictatorship." So again, Lincoln being really magnanimous and looking at the man and not just the one incident. This is where the scandalous reputation really comes into play. And this is Hooker on horse at his command post. This is his own biographer, a man named Walter Herbert, said, "Women and whiskey followed the army as they always have, and they seem to have garnered particular attention from Hooker." One of his colonels, a man named Charles Francis Adams, wrote that during the winter, when Hooker was in command, the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac was a place to which no self-respecting man liked to go, and no decent woman could go. It was a combination of barroom and brothel. And then analyzing medical issues after the Civil War, Dr. Bullitt wrote that early in 1863, a new commander of the Army of the Potomac encouraged prostitutes to visit the troops as a morale measure and repeatedly used their services liberally himself. His name has been associated with the profession. His name was General Joseph Hooker. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, and this is where he sometimes gets a hard knock. This is another multi-day battle. It's at the Battle of Chancellorsville that General Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own troops. His own troops had called out, his sentries had called out like the password, and they didn't either Jackson didn't give it or didn't hear them, and they end up shooting Jackson, and Jackson dies. That's the only positive outcome that happened for Chancellorsville for the Union side. Hooker's leading his men. General Lee is doing a great job of countering all of his movements. At one point early in the battle, Hooker seems completely out of it. He's not able to speak clearly. He's looking like he's having a hard time focusing. And his enemies say, "The guy's drinking again. This guy is in command, and he's drunk." What actually happened is he was leaning against a beam post. A cannonball slammed into it. The noise, the concussion, all of it probably gave him a massive concussion. So he wasn't actually drunk. But his enemies, it didn't matter to them. Hooker, to his discredit, even though he was really incapacitated, refused to relinquish command, and so he wasn't responding to on the ground at the moment updates from his commanders, and the Union Army is forced into retreat. And Lincoln ends up firing him. So Hooker gets into a dispute with the War Department. He gets into a dispute with Edward Stanton, and Hooker makes the mistake of saying, "Yeah, well, if you don't like it, you can fire me." And so Lincoln said, "Okay, I will." And so he's fired and replaced by George Meade. However, to his credit, he does serve with distinction the rest of the war. He goes out west. He fights at the Battle of Chattanooga very bravely, of Union victory. He fights at the Battle of Lookout Mountain very bravely. He takes command of four states, essentially the military commander of the area around Illinois, Indiana, up there. And at the end of the war, he has a really positive reputation. He actually ends up leading the funeral procession when Lincoln's casket returns to Springfield, Illinois. And if you were to visit our neighbor to the south, if you go to the Boston and see the Massachusetts State House, it's his statue that is directly in front of the Capitol there. The very last thing, just a couple resources, a couple books that I found really enjoyable that talk about some of the men who served under Lincoln. James McPherson, if you remember the Ken Burns documentary series, The Civil War, McPherson is quoted extensively throughout that documentary series. Battle Cry of Freedom is one of the kind of quintessential books about the American Civil War, won a Pulitzer Prize. A lesser-known historian, Stephen Sears, he's also written about the personalities, the people who served directly with Lincoln. That's what we have.
Anybody got any?
Yeah, any questions? Yes, sir.
Well, I got one short question, one long one.
Yeah.
I've heard the theory that Stanton was actually involved in the assassination of Lincoln, and that doesn't, meet up with your comment that he's great buddy, so.
Yeah, so Stanton, so the plot to kill Lincoln also included an attempt to kill the vice president, so Johnson, an attempt to kill Ulysses S. Grant, and an attempt to kill Seward. So at the day that Lincoln is actually assassinated, the person who was going to kill the vice president just chickened out. Grant was, by that point, on a train heading out of Washington, D.C. Seward was attacked and was brutally beaten the same night that Lincoln was killed. But Stanton did, at the very end of the war, had come to really respect and enjoy working with Lincoln.
So you don't think he was the one that was trying to kill off everybody, more importantly?
Nah.
And my second question has to do with the freeing slaves.
Yeah.
That's kind of contiguous with when he fired Fremont for doing it. That's when the Southern Sea Islands had the contrabands, where they did free the slaves. So why didn't that guy get fired also?
Yeah, I think it's more because of his popularity, Fremont's popularity, being a former presidential candidate. He's a popular author. That was going to get a lot more attention. He was also really, really concerned about Missouri. Missouri was with the Union, but was a slave state. So Lincoln, in his thinking, couldn't afford to risk Missouri switching to the Confederacy. So I think that's probably one of the biggest motivating factors behind Lincoln's decision to fire Fremont. Yes, sir?
Yeah, did I notice in the election of 1852 that Pierce lost New Hampshire?
I don't believe
Well,
so. Let me go back.
I can't really see from here.
Yeah.
Vermont. Oh, is it Vermont?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, my glasses.
Yep, so Scott only won Tennessee, Kentucky,
Yeah,
Mass,
okay.
and
All right.
Mass and
That makes more sense.
Vermont. I could be mistaken. Don't quote me on this. I could be mistaken that Vermont also was one of the only states in either the 1932 or 36 election that did not vote for FDR. So they were contrary. They were much more conservative than they are today. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks to Matt for a great program, and you're dismissed.